That would be good. You'll notice, everyone, that you're muted, and you will remain muted during the webinar. However, when it's time to ask questions, you will use the reactions menu item down below. Raise your hand, and we will call on you, and you'll be unmuted to ask your own question. So that's the way we'll do it tonight. So welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm Paul Shannon from Massachusetts Peace Action, and Mass Peace Action. Some of you have been on our webinars before, and we welcome those back. And those who haven't been on yet, we welcome you for the first time. At the end of the program, I'll mention a few things about Massachusetts Peace Action, the main anti-war and peace organization in Massachusetts, because it's quite a group, and we hope that all of you will consider being part of our efforts in whatever way that seems to make sense to you. But tonight, we're very fortunate to have Jerry Lembcke as our guest. Jerry is the author of 8 books, many of them related to Vietnam, including probably, I consider, since I haven't read his recent book, I consider the most important book he's written is The Spitting Image: Myth, Memory, and the Legacy of Vietnam. That's a book that everyone who remembers the Vietnam War and remembers the whole story of U.S. soldiers being spat on when they returned by the anti-war movements. Supposedly, this is a critical book to read to see what really happened there and what didn't happen. Then his other book is Hanoi Jane: War, Sex, and Fantasies of Betrayal. Then there is Dissenting POWs. That's his more recent book. From Vietnam Squalor Prison to America Today. And it's on that book that he, along with Tom Wilbur, wrote for Monthly Review Press that will be focused. Now, Jerry grew up in Northwest Iowa. He was drafted in 1968 and served as a chaplain's assistant with the 41st Artillery Group in Vietnam. For those of you who remember, hopefully there are some younger folks on who have no memory of this whatsoever, but 1968 was the year in the Vietnam War, with so many things going on, and the Tet Offensive and everything that followed that, leading to Nixon's election at the end of 1968. That fateful day of November, I believe November 3rd, I can't remember exactly what date it was, in 1968. Jerry is presently Associate Professor of Sociology Emeritus at Holy Cross College in Worcester. And he's Distinguished Lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. So Jerry, we want to welcome you this evening and appreciate you being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Paul.
I think that the format that Jerry and I worked out is that I'm going to start with asking some questions, and hopefully this will lead to all of you thinking about your own questions that hopefully we'll get to later on in the webinar. So let's just jump right into this, Jerry. Is that okay with you?
Sure, ready to go.
So now many of us, Jerry, I think, look back to the 1990s as a time when the free market ideology, the neoliberal ideology, and all those free market agreements under Clinton were being signed, and the tremendous impact that all that had on U.S. society in terms of factories closing as jobs were shipped overseas, and the resentment that was being created by these policies back in those days, which were followed up, of course, by Bush and by Obama and by following administrations. That neoliberal ideology just grew more and more significant all the time, as did the resentment of many people in the United States, especially working class people. And a lot of us look to those periods of time when the American living standards were undermined by these policies for many parts of the population, and not only leading to economic hardship for many Americans, but also causing this experience of a loss of place. What was happening to our country? What is happening to me and my family and our lives? We feel dislocated. We don't feel valued the way we used to. Those types of feelings, a lot of us trace the Trump phenomenon of Make America Great Again to that phenomenon. But you're going a lot further back than the 1990s and even the 1980s. You're going back to the end of the Vietnam War. So this is what we want to hear tonight about what happened after the Vietnam War affected the whole phenomenon of Trump being able to mobilize so many people in the country behind his message.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Make America Great Again. The Trump campaign slogan begs the questions: when was America great? And how and when was that greatness lost? Your introduction does sketch out some answers to that, but I think without a doubt, the really main event was the loss of the war in Vietnam. At the time, we were pretty much the undisputed, most powerful military force on earth. And we, the American people, perceived ourselves to be racially and culturally superior to the enemy that beat us. Vietnam was a small, underdeveloped, outgunned nation of Asians. And it was a hard pill to swallow for many Americans. It was a real blow to pride. You sort of touched on this, that people identify with what has happened with the larger organizations that they belong to, the symbols that they associate themselves with. How many times do we hear people say after the Red Sox lose, "We lost last night"? People who probably never played baseball in their life. Well, if that's true, it's true by many multiples for what goes on with the country, the nation that they belong to. The loss of the war in Vietnam was a loss that all Americans experienced as theirs. They had lost. We had lost. So it wasn't just a blow to American global reputation, but it was something that was felt very, very personally by people. And I think maybe more so men than women, because men, at least at that time, really identified a lot with the military. And even if they hadn't been in Vietnam, they maybe imagined themselves, or maybe they'd been in the military for some other war. So there was that.
Hold on a second, Jerry. We're having some difficulties here.
Looks like he's froze up. Hopefully he'll get freed in a minute.
Okay. Okay, you just came back, Jerry. We missed those last couple of sentences. You froze on the screen there.
Oh. Well, I was saying that our loss to Vietnam and to the people of Vietnam, who we deem to be culturally and racially inferior to us was a hard pill to swallow for Americans. And in fact, many never swallowed it. And so in the wake of that, of all of that, those mixed emotions about the war and the loss of the war, an alibi grew. An alibi was created. And the bedrock of the alibi was that we didn't lose the war to them. We lost the war to us. We lost the war to betrayal on the home front. There are three parts to the alibi. One, that we'd been sold out by weak-kneed liberals in Congress who tied one hand behind our backs, preventing us from fighting the war that needed to be fought. Secondly, that radicals in the streets and on college and university campuses undermined the military morale in Vietnam and gave aid and comfort to the communist enemies in North Vietnam. Now, the evidence for that last component of the betrayal story, that protesters spat on returning soldiers. So it went. Want to know why we think that the military was sold out? Well, look what happened to that these people did to our soldiers when they came back from Vietnam. And that was very similar to stories that were told after Germany's loss in World War I. That anti-war people in Germany scorned their soldiers when they came home, even spat on them, according to some stories. And so in short form, the alibi, the American alibi, was a reprise of the German stab in the back legend. And then there's a third component to the alibi. The story of what happened at home is that a cultural softness had settled in to America after World War II. Urbanization, New Deal entitlement programs had eroded American masculinity. We had sent a generation of sissified young men off to fight, and they weren't up to the task. Now, there are three memes in this MAGA narrative that provide some substance, some texture to what it tries to convey. And one is in its title. Another is in the deep state meme that Trump and Trump followers often repeat. A third is in the meme about Americans left behind. Right? It was one of the things that Trump won on, that he was going to represent Americans who were otherwise unrepresented in Washington. They had been left behind. And a fourth, a kind of ancillary to the deep state, is the meme of Washington insiders. Now, indications that MAGA, Make America Great Again, is enmeshed in post-Vietnam War culture began with its title. Make America Great Again is a reappropriation of Ronald Reagan's 1984 campaign slogan, "Morning Again in America." Reagan's subtext was that with his election, America had awakened from its Vietnam War nightmare and was moving on in a new day. But the Reagan slogan was only a pit stop on the through line of Republican Party preoccupations with the loss of the war, the through line that ran from Nixon through Reagan. And beside his Morning in America slogan, Reagan also, during Reagan's administration, the first POW MIA flags went up. They still fly today, something that we might want to come back to in discussion. The line runs through George Bush having kicked the Vietnam syndrome in the Persian Gulf War, and runs on to Trump's 2015 put down of John McCain for having gotten shot down. Another point to which we might want to return. So the loss of the war in Vietnam is very central to Republican Party culture, Republican Party identity. When I first heard this phrase, "Make America Great Again," I never hesitated. But, okay, this is taking us back to the closing years of the war in Vietnam and the time immediately after the war. But there are some revanchist themes in MAGA that are more about going back than moving on. The Trump people would have us not forge new institutions for a new and better future. They would have us go back to the institutional traditions of the 1950s. Those ways of life, those ways of thinking that made us great to begin with, as his followers would have it. In other words, there's a kind of back to the future thrust within the MAGA movement. We find our future, we find what we want to be, should be, could be back in the years before the war in Vietnam. Now, some of those institutions that they would have us return to and refurbish, one is marriage and family, traditional marriage and family, as they would have it. A key part of that relates to the war in Vietnam is the consequence, as they see it, of fathers absent from sons. There's an interesting new literature on what's called momism. The idea that in those post-World War II years, American small family farm economy collapsed. Family farm families moved from rural areas to cities. Sons who may have grown up with their fathers at work in fields and in farmyards up to that time, essentially raised by their dads, were now separated from their fathers who were working in factories, working in offices. The sons now being raised mostly by their mothers. And so as the analysts have looked at this, what they conclude is that some Americans see this as a problem. Boys growing up in a more permissive environment, growing up at home, not growing up around work, at least not work that their dads do. And this is what led to the softness of that generation that we sent off to Vietnam. Want to beef up America? Want to make us tough again? Want to send off a more fit for war generation? Well, we better get after this a feminizing of American culture. Now, there's an easy tie-in here, a dovetail here with the rise of the feminist movement in the late 50s, 1960s, second wave feminism, because of a really powerful analysis, right, of what happened to the war in Vietnam is that indeed feminism had its impact on men. There was a kind of a bubbling to the surface of that sort of inner feminine feelings that men have, and that during the war in Vietnam, indeed, men began to grow their hair long, or they tried to. Vietnam veterans certainly did. Men in Vietnam began to wear peace symbols on necklaces, right, around their neck. I had one of those in Vietnam. So there was all kinds of rather unmanly forms of behavior that were manifesting among the troops drafted for Vietnam, sent to Vietnam. And then running this forward, just one last sentence on this. A lot of the backlash against the anti-war movement in this post-war, lost war culture was a backlash against the women's movement. There have been a couple of books written, very good books written about this. And so some of the backlash against women, against feminism, against the women's movement was really spawned by and really embedded in this backlash against the anti-war movement, this betrayal narrative, you see. It's enmeshed in that, in a response to that allegation that the military was betrayed on the home front. The military mission was betrayed. The return to the post-war, pre-war years, then there's also a call for a less permissive parental practice. That's something very, very resonant with a lot of Republican conservatives. A lot of Trump followers would have us return to what they would consider to be more traditional school, classroom kinds of settings and behaviors, more local control of schools. Huge. Trump people are quite upset with the pernicious influence of sex education in schools. Classes, textbooks about American racial behavior, ideas about race, huge backlash to this kind of stuff. So there's this look to the past, this back to the future thrust in MAGA. That's really important to understand. Then there's the trope of the deep state. Gosh, you hear this one all the time. I heard it just a few days ago, I think probably in Trump's announcement that he would be running for president in 2024. The deep state. Now, when I first heard that phrase deep state and connected with the Trump movement, I knew where it was going. It's a dog whistle for opposition to educated elites in government agencies, of course, but also colleges and universities, educated elites in the news media, in Hollywood, settings where decisions are made affecting millions of people, but settings that are inaccessible to most Americans. I mean, you can start with government. To most people, Washington and the apparatuses of government are kind of a mystery to most Americans. What goes on in colleges and universities is similarly, a subject of imagination, fantasy. I'm always amazed. I taught at Holy Cross College here in Worcester for about 25 years. And the number happens all the time. People in Worcester will ask me about what goes on up there. Holy Cross sits up on a hill. What's it like up there? What's it like to teach at Holy Cross? There really is a mystique about these places that I think that a lot of academic people maybe are kind of oblivious to. See, so when there's a mystique like that, when people don't know, then they fill in their imaginations, right, with what they think might be going on. And then when somebody like Trump comes along, or going back, we go back to the war in Vietnam, you see, when the Nixon administration began to really come down hard on the anti-war movement, began to come down hard on protesters. And his vice president, Spiro Agnew, named the enemy, right? It was how did he put it? An effete core of impudent snobs who characterize themselves as intellectuals. Now, there's a couple of buzzwords in there besides, the intellectuals things, you see. There's that anti-elitism, that bugaboo, right? That there are people who work with ideas and who use those ideas against the interests of the rest of us. That's a pretty dangerous occupation. That's a pretty mysterious occupation. So there's that. And then there's effete. Effete. Effete means fragile, right? It means weak. I think maybe there's a kind of, we might say today, a kind of homophobic dog whistle in that. These intellectuals, these people in colleges and universities, right? They're kind of squishy people. Maybe they are somebody, they are people to be a little bit suspicious of. And so that was part of the reaction against the anti-war movement that the Trump people then pick up on. That Trump's deep state meme touches those nerves, you see. People don't think about what deep state means so much as they just feel something about that, you see. There's something about the deep state that is, a little dangerous. A little dangerous. We better listen to Trump. We better listen to what he has to say. Now, the deep state is also punitive, right? Now, this is different than, Ronald Reagan's kind of innocent. We're going to move on. We're going to regather. We're going to recreate pride in America. We're going to create a better America. Trump people aren't there yet, right? They want to go after those liberals who cost us the war in Vietnam. They want to go after the liberals, the radicals in academia, the college and professors who duped the students into their anti-war activism. They want to go after those people. And so they want to root out those subversive elements in the deep state, you see, that cost us that victory, and that today continue to weaken American resolve, continue to be a threat to security. Now, in that, and this is important because in the context of the impeachment proceedings against Trump, there was a real reprising of Watergate. Watergate was almost as much in the news as, well, after the impeachment proceedings themselves had passed. In look backs on those impeachments against Trump, Watergate begins to come in. And what in the interest in Watergate has brought back Woodward and Bernstein, the journalists who chronicled Watergate. They are now some of the hottest tickets on news shows. If you look on the internet, I mean, you can just find a pile of stories. One of the headlines, a Politico headline, reads, "Trump has redefined Watergate." Another headline infers that the Trump people will try to, in a sense, reverse the verdict on Nixon, to try to have Nixon come out, right, not as this discredited figure that he left Washington as, but to rewrite, to retell, to rebuild, reconstruct a new legacy of Ronald Reagan. Now, what Watergate was about the deep state in the closing years of the war in Vietnam. The purloining of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg juiced President Nixon's paranoia about security lapses at high levels of the government. Ellsberg was former military with access to classified documents. He was a trusted insider, but he was deceptive. He was duplicitous in the eyes of the Nixon people. He was kind of became the poster boy for the deep state. It was people like him, you see, who were buried in the woodwork at high levels of the government doing their clandestine thing. So Nixon paranoia seeped into the heartland. Suspicion of Washington insiders inspired political campaigns self-identified as outsiders. People like Trump, who promised to expose the deep state, drain the swamp, Trump said. Now, the impeachment of Trump failed, and as I've said, it has revived interest in Watergate, and I think probably brought this concern about the deep state to new levels. I mean, even Trump followers who might have, might have only heard the drain the swamp part of this when Trump ran as a candidate. Now they're going, aha. So he's really talking about what happened to Richard Nixon. He's really talking about something about the war in Vietnam that we've kind of forgotten about. And maybe we need to rethink about. Which brings me to the last meme that I want to talk about. And here we might want to bridge into more history about the POW story, the history of the POW experience in Vietnam. That meme, another very powerful meme of forgotten Americans, Americans left behind. Oh, you hear that so often from the Trump people. Now, on a kind of superficial level, outsiders running for office will claim that ordinary Americans have been forgotten by Washington insiders. And before moving on with new technology, new versions of history, think Project 1619, for example, or new curricula for race and gender studies. We need to go back and pick up those Americans who have already been left behind by all this kind of rapid change. Forgotten Americans is a catchphrase that's resonant. And it really begins with the coming home story of Vietnam veterans, and particularly the POWs. The war in Vietnam had been continued beyond its due date by Richard Nixon, who refused to negotiate an end of the war with the Vietnamese until the POWs were returned. From the Vietnamese side, they said no return of the POWs until you pull your troops out. But Nixon took a hard line on this. And so from 1969 until 1973, more and more of Nixon's appeal for support for the war was an appeal for support for the POWs who were being held in Hanoi. And when the POWs came home, there were two narratives that were afoot. One was the POWs as heroes. They were the tough guy, never say die guys, right? Who held out against the Vietnamese interrogators, who never gave up any sort of classified information, who refused to talk to Western journalists when they came to inquire into the conditions of the POWs. They were heroes. And they were the trophies, as the Nixon people saw it, as a lot of Americans saw it. They were what the war was being fought for. And we got them back, by golly. And this became a reason then to think that, oh, we won the war. We got the trophy. We got what the war was about, because that's what the war had been about since 1969, right? 2 years or more. It was about the POWs. We got them back. The war is over. We won the war. So when a lot of Americans don't seem to remember much about the war. And the reason is because the POW coming home story displaced, pushed off screen almost everything else about the war. Now, one of the other things that's lost, though, in the coming home story, one of the other narratives, was the anxiety about whether or not some of these POWs may have caved to the pressure of interrogation. Americans were really haunted by the Korean War experience with POWs. When the Korean War ended, there were, a dozen or so POWs who refused to come home. They chose to go to China rather than to come back to the United States. And the explanation for that in the United States was that they had been brainwashed, either coerced into doing what they'd done, or again, hardcore brainwashed. They had been made complicit, right, in what the North Vietnamese wanted, perhaps even without coercion. So the cultural artifact of that a lot of listeners will remember is the Hollywood film The Manchurian Candidate that starred Frank Sinatra. And so that's what Americans have had on their mind for years, the years during which there were POWs that came home. So there was always this question about how loyal they had been. Well, then the POWs hit stateside in February of 1973. And by the way, it's a good thing that we have a chance to talk about that, because the 50th anniversary of the end of the war is coming up in a few months, and the anniversary of the return of the POWs. So it's a good time to take a second look at what went on during those weeks and months of that return. And a quick look back at newspaper headlines, New York Times headlines. Ooh, Paul, front page, above the fold, headlines about this question of loyalty, this question of brainwashing. So the book that I wrote with Tom Wilbur that came out about 18 months ago, Dissenting POWs. There was a group of POWs who came out against the war while they were still being held as prisoners in Vietnam. They were not part, they were not part of this hero, tough guy population of POWs. They had come out against the war. Well, there was a spate of New York Times stories then about this and what the government was doing to hush them up, usher them off stage as quickly as possible, try to explain away what they were seeing, what they were doing, try to account for that. But all of this has kind of gotten lost in the American story. Now, I said we might touch on Trump's poke at John McCain for being shot down. What in the world was that about? Well, shortly after.
Jerry, could you kind of explain exactly what Trump said for people who maybe missed that part of his message?
In the election campaign for the 2016 election, in a 2015 campaign stop in Iowa, there was support being expressed for John McCain because he was a Vietnam War POW. He was a Navy pilot. He had been shot down during the war, and he'd been held as a prisoner in Hanoi. And so he was one of those people who came home heroically as a returned prisoner. John McCain was also from a quite privileged background. Both his father and his grandfather were Navy admirals. So he was very much part of the military elite before he even went in to Vietnam. So, but Trump said, oh, nice that John McCain is a Navy veteran. Hooray for John McCain. Came home as a hero. But I like my pilots who weren't shot down. Now, a lot of people, what? What is Trump? Trump is supposed to be all about patriotism. And the ultimate patriots are these guys who were shot down, captured, and held prisoner in Hanoi. What in the world is Trump talking about? Well, there's a hardcore right wing within the Trump movement that believes that not all of our prisoners came home. Right, this was widely believed, well, maybe still believed today, I don't know, but well into the 2000s, this was widely believed. And these hardcore rightists within the Republican Party believe it, and they believe that Trump knew what happened to these missing POWs and that Trump has kept it a secret all these years. Now, in 2000, Ross Perot, who was himself a candidate for president years back, an early IT magnate, billionaire. In 2000, Ross Perot alleged that some US POWs were traded to the Soviets in order to get a more favorable settlement to the end of the war in Vietnam. 2 years later, a guy named Ted Sempley wrote that that was true. Some POWs were traded to the Soviets, and John McCain knows that. So McCain, you see, by poking his finger in McCain's eye, was currying favor with this ultra right wing element within his movement. It was a sort of a nod, right, to them saying, yep, I understand what you're saying. And this is what I did. This is what I'm doing. Now, there's another piece to this too, so maybe a smaller piece, but a lot of Vietnam veterans were not happy with the hoopla piled on the POWs when they came home. A lot of Vietnam veterans, many of them home by that time for 5, 6, 7 years, ground troops who had had really rough going in South Vietnam, thought these POWs had it pretty nice. I mean, they at least slept with a roof over their heads, right? And they had maybe not good meals, but they had meals every day. No welcome home parades for us. No escorts back into our hometowns, right? No heroism for us. So there was resentment of them. And you can read these Newsweek magazine. We quote some of this in our book, by the way, in the book, Dissenting POWs. We quote some of these letters that were written to editors. The Newsweek magazine, I think, is one that we quote. So you can see those in the book. Now, back to the liberals. There's an allegation, you see, that the government kept a secret about the missing POWs. That our own government, of course, knew that not all of the POWs came home. And the government kept that a secret, did not want people to know about this. Some of this, and this is the last thing I want to say about this, some of this came out, by the way, in 1998 when CNN broadcast a story that they called Operation Tailwind. Excuse me, yes. No, they called it Valley of Death. But it was about Operation Tailwind, a covert raid into Laos in 1970 or 71, in which it was alleged that the US government used sarin nerve gas to kill some defectors who had gone over to the North Vietnamese along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What? Now, this had the imprimatur, by the way, this news story, of name's going to escape me, might come back to me in a minute. But there were people involved in the making of this CNN broadcast who said, it's even more interesting than that, because US Special Forces actually went after not defectors to the North Vietnamese, but actually went after its own US POWs who had been captured in Laos and held in Laos. They were in territory. Peter Arnett was the journalist that I was trying to think of. Peter Arnett was the broadcaster for this story. Peter Arnett. So the spooky story here, right, is that the US actually went after its own POWs because they had been captured in so-called denied territory, where the US government said, we have no troops there. If they had come home, they would have been living evidence that the government had been lying all these years. And so the government went after them and killed them. Whoa, what a story. You see, now that was 1998, right? In terms of where we are today, I mean, in terms of how these stories sort of cook within the political culture, that's not that long ago. And so that is all of that is out there floating around. So maybe we should stop there.
Yeah, Jerry, why don't we go into some questions? People can raise your hand with any points you'd like to make. I'd ask everyone to keep their comments to a minute or so. But I just want to remind people what you're saying, Jerry, is once that POW MIA movement got going, that POWs were left behind, that MIAs were left behind. Yeah. I mean, that theme was the strongest single current in US society for 20 years.
Thank you, Paul.
The war ended. The POW MIA movement was the most significant social movement at the time. And when we see those POW flags on government buildings, they're there by law. The POW movement intimidated the government to prove that it had not left Americans behind by saying, we will never forget you. Right. We will never forget you. We will bring you back. So that just plays beautifully into Trump's message of Americans left behind. So that's an important thing to think about, I think.
Well said, Paul.
Why don't we go to Mike Heichman? Can we unmute Mike, Paul?
Yes, Jerry, that was, I never heard of you. You're brilliant. That was fantastic. I'm 76 years old, and I lived through that period. And whatever you had to say, which was absolutely brilliant about the war in Vietnam, I also think that parallel to this is the freedom movement, which began in the 50s. So it's like, you know, in terms of loss, betrayal, a change in the culture and stuff, whatever you had to say about Vietnam, for me, you know, I'm pleased that I'm making a statement, but I'm asking if you agree with me or not.
Say again what the movement is that you're referring to.
The freedom movement, the civil rights movement.
The civil rights movement.
Yeah, it's like, you know, it's in the last election, 56% of the white people voted for Trump, you know, and I believe you have to go back maybe to Clinton. I don't even think Clinton, to find a time when the majority of white people voted for a Democrat for president. You know, it's like, you know, it's like there's a betrayal in terms of the loss of the war, but a betrayal in terms of our racial status here too.
Yeah.
So, you know, I just wanted to say that I thank you for your brilliant analysis, but I wanted to expand it to the issue of race in our culture.
Sure. Thanks. Paul, do you want me to comment on that, or?
Yes.
Okay. Very quickly. There's a great new book out. The title is How White Men Won the Culture War. How White Men Won the Culture War. The author is Joseph Darda, D-A-R-D-A. And his analysis is that the image of Vietnam veterans as victims of the war, essentially, and I think this is the word he uses, minoritized white Vietnam veterans. It made them into a hurt minority. The war left them damaged and enabled the re-identification of them from a racially superior and privileged population to fellow victims with Black people, other ethnic, other suppressed, repressed minorities. It aligned them with them. In terms of their own thinking, there's a kind of what about us sentiment, you see, that kicked in with Vietnam veterans themselves, and then with the larger population. We know, I'm writing a new book, by the way, with the title Victim Veterans in the title. Right, this idea that in some people's words, everybody came home from Vietnam damaged. We all came home, if not physically hurt, we came home psychologically hurt. That we were all victims of the war. Anyway, that's it. That's one of my recommendations for a read.
That's another talk.
And that is, it's a fascinating thesis.
Let's go to Michael Hoey. Can you unmute Michael?
Yeah,
Cole?
I'm already unmuted. So my question is with regards to brainwashing in the time of Korea, the POWs, it was assumed had been brainwashed, which I guess led the CIA to conduct all kinds of experiments, including with LSD and mescaline and other stuff. So what I'm wondering is how that reaction of the what would be considered the deep state, the CIA and other organizations, what happened in Vietnam that caused them to do the kind of things, or I'm probably not asking that right, but every time there's these assumptions that the soldiers are being somehow messed with, then there's a government agency like the CIA that says, okay, we'll fix that. And then special operations gets extra training, eventually combat soldiers. So I'm looking for parallels in the 60s to the kind of reaction that the government had in the 50s.
Well, what I can say that might be relevant is the reaction that particularly the pilots had, which isn't exactly on the point of your question, but a lot of the very high-ranking pilots who were shot down in their memoirs, and by the way, I've read 30-some of the POW memoirs, most of them written by shot down pilots. And a lot of them refer to the touches that they got with the Korean War brainwashing narrative in their coursework at the Naval Academy or the Air Force Academy, or sometimes they just refer to popular culture, films that they'd seen or books that they've read, and they were likely to say that. And when I read that, by golly, I resolved that I would never give in. I would never capitulate if I was captured and if I was interrogated. Now, maybe that leads kind of back into your question, to the question being, so what kind of training did these guys get about brainwashing? And what kind of formal training? I mean, they were certainly schooled in what's called the Uniform Military Code of Justice, and what they are supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do if they're captured. But I guess I have wondered myself from time to time if there wasn't something more to their training. And I guess for me, it's an unanswered question right now. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, so that lessons from the Korean War seem to affect those POWs and led to their creation of their hero myth around the
Exactly.
POWs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's take one last question. Howard McIntyre. Howard, do you have a question?
Yes. Jerry, could you talk some about the Obama attempt to memorialize the war?
Sure can. His 2012 Memorial Day speech, which he delivered in front of the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington, with the then, what's his name? I forgot, Vietnam veteran, Secretary of the Veterans Administration, I think at the time, at his side. He basically used Vietnam veterans as a prop, as a prop for a campaign speech that he was making on Memorial Day, and saying, I'm pretty close to verbatim here, that we're not going to let happen again what happened to our soldiers when they came home from Vietnam. We're not going to let that happen again. Now, the next day, the LA Times editorialized that Obama had invoked the myth of spat upon veterans. And a myth, the LA Times said, an edifying myth, they said, but still a myth. So they really called out Obama on that. Now, this was also when Obama announced a forthcoming 12-year series of commemorative activities and provided some funds for that. I've never really followed up on what those funds were or how those funds got used, but is that what you had in mind, Howard?
Yeah, but I wanted to talk about how he framed the issue in terms of rehabilitating the war.
Well, I think the subtext of that, and I might be forgetting other things that he said, but the subtext of that alone was that this was a righteous war. At least the people who came home from that war are to be not dishonored and not disrespected. So it's a kind of a rehabilitation, I would say, of the Vietnam veteran, a kind of jab at the anti-war left for having mistreated Vietnam veterans. I mean, certainly that was the subtext of what he was saying, the way that they were treated, we aren't going to do that again, and so forth. So I might be forgetting something that you have in mind. Go ahead, though, Howard.
No, I think Jerry, that he's just saying that basically Obama said, we're not going to let our soldiers ever be treated without pride ever again. That's what this celebration is all about. Like you said, Jerry, it was an attack on the anti-war movement for having spat on the soldiers.
Yeah, sure was.
And it couldn't have been any clearer. And, it was just an amazing thing that Obama, of all people, would give a speech that Nixon would have been happy to give any day.
Yeah, I think so too.
But I think Howard is just pointing out that mythology kind of just lives on, and related to the lost war in Vietnam. Brian, did you have a last question that you wanted to raise there? I noticed you had your hand raised, or is it just time that we have to go?
No, I did have my hand raised. I was wondering if Jerry had seen the remake of The Manchurian Candidate. It kind of gets at some of those, some criticisms of the deep state that I think are a bit more apt. Did you see the film, Jerry?
Oh, yes.
Okay,
I've seen the original film many times, and I have seen the new film, but that did not come to mind for me. I'm glad to hear that from you. I'm inclined now to take a second look at the new film.
Yeah, in the movie, instead of the Manchurian Candidate referring to the Chinese brainwashing POWs, it referred to a large multinational corporation, really a deep state representation called Manchurian Global. And actually, one of the villains was a U.S. senator played by Meryl Streep, who brainwashes to try and get a corporate representative in her own son elected president.
See, I saw it. When did that come out? It probably
2004.
came out.
2004. I just looked it up. It was a big movie with Denzel. And,
yeah. See, I think I saw it at a time when I wasn't asking the questions that you were asking. It just was not on my mind, and so I did not see that. It's kind of an epistemological point to be made there by our exchange. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting film. It's almost the same. It's the same movie, but from an anti-war perspective.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for that.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for staying with us. I just reiterate a few things that Jerry said. With Trump's presidency, we are going to hear the Make America Great Again theme reiterated in various ways over and over. We're going to hear about Americans left behind. We're going to hear about Washington insiders, the people who abandoned our POWs, who said they all came home, but they didn't really. They abandoned them to the communists. These mythologies, they don't just emerge in the last 20 years, but Jerry's book is showing that they go back to the Vietnam War itself. That far back, even though people don't even think about the Vietnam War anymore, these themes resonate throughout the culture and are just waiting there for someone like Trump to figure out how to exploit them and to attach people's grievances today to those same themes. And so, even though it's late, I'd like to ask you one last question, Jerry. How do you judge that these mythologies coming out of the Vietnam War, all related to the lost war mythology, how are they affecting the peace movement today, do you think?
Oh, well, the mythology of spat upon veterans is very powerful. It has a very dampening effect on the peace movement. I've seen this firsthand with students afraid to associate with the anti-war movement, lest they be accused of hating soldiers, of hating veterans. And they'll come to me and say, God, well, how should I feel about this? That's one answer.
Yeah.
To the question. Yeah.
So it's just something that we all have to be aware of, how these mythologies are playing out in our own actions today, and keep an eye on this stuff as Trump comes up.
We hear about Republicans who are afraid to speak out. I mean, at least that's what the news people tell us, that they're afraid of crossing Trump's path. They're intimidated by Trump, and so we're not always getting the best of their judgment, and so there's another part of that.
Yeah. Well, Jerry, thank you so much for spending the evening with us, for sharing these ideas, to giving us all kinds of things to think about. Really appreciate it very much. I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. And this is one of many webinars that Mass Peace Action has put on many different topics and many different levels of topics. And we hope that you'll continue to participate in these webinars. And just to mention that, of course, it does take money to run this operation. And Peace Action is going to be engaged in a fundraising effort here in December, like 5 million other organizations that are bombarding you with emails. But just think of what a unique organization Peace Action is, and see whether it matches up to your values and your hopes of what the country could become. So I'd ask you to think about that. And the last thing I'll just say is that everyone who registered for the webinar tonight will get a follow-up email. It will give you a link to the program, where if you think other people that weren't here tonight would like to see it, they can watch it on the Peace Action YouTube page. So you'll get that link, and you will also get the link to Jerry's new book on this POW issue. It really develops it in great detail, as well as a few other links that may be of interest to you. So again, Jerry, thanks very much. Thanks to everyone on the call, and we'll be in touch as time goes on. Important days coming up. Thank you.
Good night.